Morning and welcome to Bold Like a Leopard, also known as the Razor Sharp News Chronicle Razor Sharp Report. And I want you to take a look at the description below. There will be a link to this podcast on all of the different social media and alternative social media and video hosting sites, whether it's Gab, Gettr, Minds, Truth Social, and I also have Rumble, Bitchute, and Odysee in terms of the video hosting. And I also have a Substack newsletter that I send out usually twice a month, maybe a little bit more often right now. The topic today, getting into some positive news, although not too positive, but still something to look at, is the referendum that happened on Sunday in Chile. And for those of you that are unaware, I know most Americans could care less about what happens in Chile after it's all the way at the other end of our hemisphere, at this near Antarctica, actually. So who cares? Well, the people of Chile made a choice this weekend whether to adopt a new constitution that its supporters were touting as the most progressive in the world. Not in South America, not in the history of, not in the history of Latin America, but in the world, because it had a number of provisions, including new autonomous rights and structures, like court structures for indigenous people, and some equality measures based on gender. So there were implements within the Constitution that would make any government board, from the federal all the way down to the local level, required to have 50-50 proportion of women to men. So basically it was a constitution that was meant to satisfy a lot of the progressive ideas of the 21st century. And a lot of the parties that supported that new constitution were ones that would be either traditional or modern progressive left. They have a party called Comunes, which means the commons. That is a party that supports what's called socialism of the 21st century. What is socialism of the 21st century? It's repackaged trash. It's the same stuff that their predecessors were saying, just with a little bit of a more updated packaging, right? It's like going to Walmart, or not Walmart, but Big Lots, and you see crap that didn't sell at a different store, and they're selling it now with a discounted price. So they had them, and there was the Communist Party of Chile, and then you had a number of other left and liberal and humanist parties that were supporting it. And on the other side were mainly parties that were, either classically liberal or staunchly right-wing Christian conservative. And the truth is that the result, thankfully, was that the Constitution was rejected. And I say thankfully because I think that many of the people who were supporting it were not pushing it along based on its own merits, but based on some perceived deficiencies in the existing one. The existing Constitution of Chile, which is valid as of today, it's not going anywhere until further notice, was constituted under Augusto Pinochet, who was the military dictator of Chile back in the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of the reason that people are saying, we need to get rid of this old constitution, is simply because of the person who was in charge when it was passed. And you can understand that a little bit. After all, let's not forget that Pinochet came to power under, basically with the help of a military coup by the military that he was commanding. And the person that he displaced, Salvador Allende, was democratically elected, and he was the first radical, some would say communist president of Chile. And for years, people on the political left have said rightfully that this was an area where the CIA simply meddled in the affairs of one of our Latin American neighbors. They're not a direct neighbor, but they're still a country that has very strong commercial ties to the U.S. So they were saying that the CIA intervened in order to get Chile to overthrow its democratically elected government. Well, at the time, that they were correct, and you can't ignore historical facts like that. Pinochet he derived his rule simply from military force, or that when he needed to enforce his rule, he actually made his political opponents disappear, often forever. And they would sometimes even be dropped from helicopters into the Pacific Ocean. So these are memes that have been made famous and are laughed at by people on the political right. And those are issues that you have to confront when you talk about the legacy of somebody who ruled their country for about 15 years. So why should this constitution be advantageous over the one that they were proposing? Well, you have to look at the roots of why Chile underwent that coup in 1973, and whether the pain of the coup was warranted given the reality that Salvador Allende was putting on Chile. When Allende took power, he promised to eliminate the inequality and exploitation that these mining companies and other commercial concerns were imposing on the Argentinian people, especially indigenous communities in the north, which is, I believe, more arid, and there's simply there were no labor protections at the time. And he was saying, well, we're going to create a more equal society. In the event, it didn't really work. And those people that say, well, Allende was sabotaged by the CIA because they wrecked his economy, it's the same idea as the people who, in the past 15 years, have been saying that Venezuela is a failure because of sabotage or because of economic warfare. That's a term that they use, economic warfare by the U.S. against the people of Venezuela. Well, it's not economic warfare when your own government is they're passing economic policies that on basic review just aren't plausible. Borrowing debt that is several times the size of the country's GDP, most nations are unable to manage that. Not most nations, every nation besides the United States. And why can the United States manage to borrow way above the amount that we make every year? Because we're we have the reserve currency of the world. Other nations use the dollar at the moment for transactions between each other because it's the reserve currency, and that status can be lost. So people thinking that this can go on forever are also mistaken. But for a nation that is among those that isn't anywhere close to being the reserve currency of the world, like Chile, which doesn't really have much weight to throw around on the international stage, apart from being able to trade and interact on a good basis with its neighbors and with other nations in the world. So Chile certainly couldn't do it, and we should probably be we should be surprised that people over there believe that the type of debt-based massive social spending that they were proposing, that they're still proposing because they can still do it even with the current constitution. Why is it that Chileans are supporting it at all? Well, the reason is because a legend has grown around what happened in 1973, where the underpinnings of why Pinochet overthrew Allende, they're used in order to negate and obscure the failure of the Allende government. They did not cause economic inequality to decrease. They actually caused capital flight. They caused a lot of the richer Chileans to simply shelter their holdings and make sure that they couldn't be found by their by the tax authorities. The reason that people who are on the political right, we don't believe in social welfare, is because often the people who end up having to pay for it aren't the super rich. First of all, because the super rich may have a lot of money, but they don't have enough money to cover social welfare spending. And in the end, the spending isn't worth much because you have, you simply have the money supply becomes diluted, and the money itself is not really representative of a good amount to sustain people. People end up going hungry because the money that they have from inflation isn't worth the goods that they need to make ends meet. So that was what was happening in Chile. That was what was going to continue. It would have been impoverished to the point of being a destitute country under Allende if he would have remained in power. So while you can acknowledge that everything that Pinochet did in order to oust Allende from power was, in ethical terms, wrong, you have to also point at Allende and say, this is a person who dug his own grave. It's not a moral question in that case. When you ruin a nation's economy and you declare that it's going to be a class war between the rich and the poor, or between natives and non-natives in some cases, then you end up taking a nation and rending it asunder. And that was what was happening with Salvador Allende. And what happened with Pinochet, ironically, we just, this is a theme I was thinking about. We just commemorated the recent death of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last leader of the Soviet Union. And why was Gorbachev such an important figure? Well, this was a person who was a lifelong communist, and or at least up until he left power, who wanted to reform a system that was deficient and falling apart. That's why Gorbachev was the most important leader of the Soviet Union, and if he was, or at least the most important one in our lifetimes, okay, because the system that he took over in 1986 or 85 was falling apart. The efficiency of the Soviet system had run its course, and what was going to happen if somebody would have continued down the same path as his predecessors. Let's say Gorbachev had never undertaken the two processes that led to the fall of the Soviet Union for good, Perestroika and Glasnost. Let's say that they had never happened, and he would have just continued to rule under the same top-down state hierarchical system that had happened, that had been in place under his predecessors, Chernenko and Andropov. Well, what we would have seen would be more issues of simple industrial and social rot, where the Soviet economy would go through a number of crises, and there would be issues like what happened at Chernobyl in 1986, where deficient design and planning had led to a major disaster that was only compounded by bureaucracy that got in the way of finding a real solution. That was the real problem that the Soviet Union was suffering through, and the structure of Soviet communism made it impossible for them to really cope with these crises that were coming forward. So Gorbachev did the thing that he had to do. He knew that something had to change, or else there would have been widespread failure of Soviet systems all over the country. So Perestroika was the restructuring of the Soviet economy, the introduction of certain market mechanisms, not immediately, but through gradual introduction. And Glasnost was backing off of some of the repressive social measures, like allowing for certain criticism in the press and open exercise of religious freedom for up to a point. I think I don't believe that you could necessarily have total freedom on both of those counts, but that's what he did. And the point that I'm making here is that Gorbachev and Pinochet, they're leaders from roughly the same era, but they have a major difference. Gorbachev is he's hailed as a person who made the necessary changes to a system that was not working. And Pinochet is condemned as an evil dictator with no conscience, who's bloodthirsty, but who nevertheless he oversaw an economic boom because he made the right decisions and brought the Chilean economy back from the brink of disaster by hiring a number of people as economic advisors that had been schooled in the Chicago economic the Chicago Economic Group. I don't remember what they were exactly called, but in Chile they actually started calling them the Chicago Boys, and many of these people studied under the legendary economist Milton Friedman. So people who try to say, well, all that you can remember Pinochet from was the coup and all the brutality that he enacted afterward. That's not quite the truth, because managing the economy, turning Chile into a successful economic story, it does not negate the civil liberties infringements that he committed, but it shows the way to creating a society where where that's growing, the economy is growing, civil society can grow stronger, and eventually the outcry became strong enough that they decided that they don't want Pinochet anymore. They actually voted in 1988 to reject another 6-year term for him and leave Chile ready for a new election, for a new leader. And it was all under that 1980 Constitution, the one that supposedly was imposed by this disgusting dictator who can't be trusted. And again, this is an issue that I think is interesting, and this isn't something that I think people should take and say, oh, you're just being an apologist for Pinochet. The reality is, okay, if you look at it objectively, instead of just through the lens of ideology and through the crimes that he did commit, Pinochet's constitution stood the test of time. The person who succeeded him ultimately wasn't another flunky of Pinochet. He could have also rigged the elections, which he didn't. Instead, they brought in the voters. I mean, the voters voted for Patricio Aylwin, who was a kind of a centrist politician who wanted to distance Chile from the brutality of the Pinochet era. So those people who are trying to make the case that, oh, this was a constitution that would ensure that the oligarchs and the evil coup plotters remain in power, well, there's no evidence that that actually happened. And in fact, over the years, many different styles of political parties have had their leaders elected to the presidency and to high office in Chile. You've had Michelle Bachelet, who was the socialist president of Chile, and she was actually I would say she was the first female president of Chile. And then besides her, you've had Sebastián Piñera, who was the right-leaning conservative president of Chile. And lately you've had Gabriel Boric, who was elected under the old constitution. He's the current far-left leader of Chile. And those people who are saying, well, this constitution, it limited democracy, it limited the people's choice. If that were true, why would they even allow somebody to get into a position where they can scrap the constitution? The issue that came up of having a new constitution actually occurred because in 2019, there were massive protests where people were saying, well, we need a new constitution. So this was before Corona and everything. And another referendum took place in 2020 where people voted on whether to begin the process of drafting a new constitution. And in the end, it was an even greater margin of victory for the people who were trying to get a new constitution. They ended up getting it by, I think, 89% to 11%. So those who are saying, oh, this constitution is so undemocratic, people don't even feel that they're connected to the issues that matter. They're not connected to the government that rules over them. There was compulsory voting, and people did go out and vote, and they supported the left-wing people who wanted a new constitution. Now, what happened that they lost their vote at this point? Well, when you throw in stuff that people on closer inspection see as blatantly tainting the society that they grew up in, when you put things in that have to do with quote-unquote gender equality, which isn't, right? When you do quota systems, that's not equality. That's actually something that you know, if I say, oh, I get 5 people on the board, you get another 5. That's not equality. That's just dividing the spoils. So that's really what was happening. There was also, there were reports that there were a lot of like very bawdy and disgusting demonstrations, including with drag queens in Chile before the vote, and apparently that didn't go very well. That didn't go down very well in Latin America, in Chile. So they rejected it. So ultimately the behavior and the demeanor and also the features and the bells and whistles that were in this new constitution were driving it underwater in the polls. And rather than support it, the polls started to show that Chileans in increasing numbers were against it. So before the vote actually happened, the average polling margin was about 55 to 45 against the Constitution being approved. So it was a basic yes/no vote, and the no's had 55% in the opinion polls. On election day itself, it ended up being almost 62% against the Constitution. So what did the media say? Or not the media so much as social media, as people in the West and in Chile itself who had been for the yes side, who wanted to change the Constitution, what did they chalk up the results to? Well, they said it was disinformation. They said it was lies and distortions about the Constitution and about things that weren't actually in it, including abortion up until birth. Well, the truth is that if you guarantee the right of any woman to have an abortion, as they were putting into that Constitution, and you don't put in any limitations or statements as far as when does this procedure become not abortion but actually killing a child, which is the way I think almost all abortion is. But when you leave no limit explicitly within a law, yes, it leads to the possibility of late or even postpartum abortion. And this is something that in the U.S., a significant number of us find to be barbaric. But in Latin America, in Chile, which has a very large Catholic plurality, I think they might even have a majority still in Chile of Catholic adherents. It was probably way too much to swallow, and people went out to the polls and rejected it. And this is something that's not entirely predictable. In Ireland, a few years back, this was something that was a shocker to me, but maybe not a shocker to people who live in Ireland and follow it more closely. The Irish actually approved a constitutional amendment that legalized abortion. And I don't know what the limits were over there, but the legalization of abortion in a country that is so identifiably Catholic as Ireland, it would show that religion can tell you a lot about a nation's character, but not everything. And therefore, the Irish decided that they're more politically progressive than they are socially Catholic. In Chile, apparently, it's not the same. So we have to start to question some of our presumptions about these nations. People around the world think that the Chilean people, because of the 1973 coup, that they are against this legacy of Pinochet, that they need something to replace him, that his shadow, that his demonic soul floats over them and keeps them in the doldrums and prevents them from actually achieving real progress in life. And in reality, if you probably ask many Chileans, that's not really the reason that they go about their daily lives and vote the way they do and support the choices that they end up making. The reason is that they know practically that the nations around them have been wrecked and destroyed by the policies of people like the president that they unfortunately elected. And I think that it was a massive mistake of the Chilean people to elect him, but you have to, there's a very sharp difference that I've noticed between the ways that conservative and right-leaning and traditionalist people and libertarians accept election results, and the way that left-wing socialists and if you know Six Hexenhammer, he calls them leftoids. Leftoids, they don't accept election results without having to frame it in the context either that the vote was rigged and the election was bought by massive commercial concerns, by corporate America, by the CIA, by one of these culprits, or even recently by the Russian government. So they have to frame it that way. Or they want to say that it was disinformation, that it was the voters being completely misinformed, or that the voters were too dumb to understand what was good for them. That's the mindset that they have, that if people were truly enlightened and if they knew how good this is for them, what we're trying to plan for them, they would of course vote for it, because the only reason that they vote for the right wing, according to this mindset, is because the poor and the middle class are hypnotized by the right into voting against their own interests. It never occurs to these people that a lot of these voters who are middle class, poor, or maybe moderately wealthy, they can decide what their own interests are. If their interests are that they want to vote according to their faith, or if they want to vote according to their own personal preference in regards to a certain issue, or they want to keep more money in their pocket rather than supply it to generous social spending, then that's really them looking after their own interests. They don't have to look after the interest of people who are preaching to them that they are looking out for the common good. In fact, I was reading yesterday, I think it was regarding the issue of school vouchers. I was doing some late night reading, way too late, but there was a website that was against school vouchers that was saying that the reason that they're bad is because it is being promulgated, school vouchers, by people who think that they have a right to say where their tax dollars go, as opposed to what the opponents of school vouchers say, which is that your tax dollars have to go for the common good. If you think that you have a say in where your dollars go, then you're not really for the common good, you're only in it for yourself. And I think that the natural reaction to that would be, so if I'm not in it for myself, if I shouldn't be in it for myself, you're saying that you're doing this out of selflessness, you're not going to act out of your own selfish need? What type of person actually believes that? If you look at most of these progressive leaders that are out there, they openly act selfishly. You have Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. While his nation suffers through record inflation, he hops a plane to Costa Rica and has a vacation with the wife and kids. So these are people who they want to talk all the time about the common good and everybody's responsibility and how it takes all of us. And then when it comes to their own personal life, they think that they have an entitlement to privileges that you and I could never dream of. It's the same thing with Gavin Newsom. when he decides, the governor of California decides that he doesn't want to abide by the mask mandate. He goes to a very fancy restaurant where everything costs an arm and a leg. He ends up getting caught doing it, and he makes absolutely no apologies for it. In fact, he makes a number of excuses, including the false one, transparently false, that he had been outside the whole time and he didn't need to wear a mask. And he doesn't admit, for example, that his kid was playing, I think he was playing soccer or something, without a mask when everybody else in public schools had to play with a mask. So these are all issues where they say it's unfair for you to bring in my children and my personal behavior into the public debate, but you have to abide by all of these rules that I myself am incapable of following. So it's the classic rules for me but not for thee, or rules for thee but not for me. I had it backwards paradigm. So those are all issues that I think go into why people rejected this constitutional change in Chile, and I'm sure that many of them were looking at other nations in South America that had gone through major socialist periods in recent history. You have Venezuela, you now have Colombia, you have Chile's own government is socialist, you have Argentina, which is going through yet another economic crisis. It's like Argentina has some sort of custom. It's like you know how people wait, 17 years for the cicadas to hatch. So in Argentina they must wait like 6 years for their economy to default on its debt. That's the mindset of people who are hardcore socialist morons, that they don't care what the consequences of their past actions are, because for them it's a belief system. It's something that is it's a faith in an economy that in reality there's no logic or reason to it. People don't make their decisions based on the common good. People, unfortunately, are selfish, and I say that unfortunately because I think that capitalism and free enterprise, they're the ways that people naturally behave, and that includes the evil behavior that we have, people pushing drugs and alcohol or gambling or other vices at a people, prostitution. Those are natural inclinations that are an element of why free enterprise is the natural human condition. That doesn't mean that everything that we do should be looked at in a positive light. That doesn't mean that the people who work to sustain that way of living, people like Pinochet, that we should just look over issues that they have done, issues that they have with their record that could be, especially, worthy of condemnation, right? What happened with Pinochet, you can talk all you want about his brutality, but you also have to talk about the success of the economic policy. And at the same time, you can talk all about the success of his economic policy, and you can still acknowledge that it was very brutal and cruel, the type of rule that he put into effect in Chile. So that's about it. This is a little bit of a departure. I hope I'm going to have another video either today or tomorrow. But meanwhile, what you can do is look at that link tree below and click on that. You'll get to see all of my links on all the social media, Gab, Gettr, Subscribestar. I have Minds, Truth Social. You also can find me on Odysee, Rumble, and Bitchute for your video hosting. Please stop using YouTube. They get rid of, if you subscribe on YouTube, often they'll remove you from the subscription list. Just go try something new. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't, but at least you'll know.